Thank you, Cameron. Good evening and welcome everyone to our community information session on the Pennsylvania multi-site health study on PFAS in drinking water. The study team consists of RTI International, Pennsylvania Department of Health, Temple University, and Brown University, and we also have Bucksmont Coalition for Safer Water as a consultant on this project. Next slide. Our agenda tonight includes a special presentation by Dr. Jamie DeWitt from East Carolina University. This is on how PFAS exposure might affect our body's responses to COVID-19. We will also watch a video message produced by Bucksmont Coalition, featuring a person who, like many of you in the community, have been very personally affected by PFAS contamination, and she's going to disclose why she is choosing to participate in this study. We will also hear more about the study boundaries and who is eligible to participate, and we'll show you the location of our site office where the clinic appointments will be taking place. And those updates will be given by Mr. Sterling Cummings and Ms. Suzanne Triplett, both of RTI. Next slide. You will have an opportunity to ask questions tonight. We will pause at the end of Dr. DeWitt's presentation and also at the end of our meeting tonight. You can raise your hand, and it's best probably if you wait until we actually call for questions before you raise your hand, so it's not up there for the whole time. And then you'll be able to verbally ask your questions. If you would prefer, you can also submit it through the Q&A, the question and answer feature. We ask that you not use the chat function. We want to be able to be sure that we don't miss any questions. So the fewer places that they're placed, the better for us to keep track of it. So now I'd like to introduce our lead person on this study. This is Dr. Linda Brown from RTI, and she will be giving us a brief overview of the study's goals. Hi, Linda.
Next slide, please. All right, thanks everybody. So I'm the contact principal investigator, and I'm a senior director of epidemiology at RTI International. So the next slide. So just as a reminder, Pennsylvania is one of 7 sites participating in the multi-site study, or MSS as we call it for short, and it's supported by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, and this is part of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. The other sites are in California, Colorado, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, and Michigan. So the goal of the whole MSS study is to learn more about health outcomes and PFAS exposure from contaminated drinking in different populations. And then its other goal is really to help people understand the risks for health effects. For the Pennsylvania multi-site study, we are specifically studying the health effects of drinking water contaminated by firefighting foam used by the military bases in the area. Your participation in this study will help address health and environmental concerns related to PFAS exposure in your community. In addition, knowledge of your PFAS levels could also help your healthcare providers better understand the possible PFAS-related symptoms. So we will, throughout this whole thing, encourage you and remind you the importance of our participating in this health study. So now I want to turn the meeting over to our guest speaker, Dr. Jamie DeWitt from East Carolina University, and she's going to discuss the topic PFAS exposure and COVID-19.
Thank you, Linda, so much. And thank you, everybody, for inviting me to be here to talk to you all tonight. In my laboratory at East Carolina University, I'm in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology. And in my laboratory, I studied the effects of PFAS on the immune system. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about what we understand about the effects of PFAS on the immune system, give you a little bit of a primer on what the immune system does, because I know we're thinking about the immune system a lot more these days because of COVID. And then discuss a little bit about some of the findings that are starting to emerge with respect to PFAS exposure and COVID. So next slide, please. So what does the immune system do? What is the function of the immune system? And I think about the immune system almost every day because I work with the immune system. One of the main roles of the immune system is to provide a barrier between us and the outside world. Our bodies are actually really enticing to a lot of microorganisms. We've got lots of food and lots of places to hide. So many microorganisms, such as bacteria and viruses, try to get inside of our bodies and take advantage of what we have for them in terms of a nice living space. And so our immune system helps to provide a barrier between us and those bacteria and viruses. But surprisingly, the immune system really does a lot to maintain our body's normal health. Sometimes we have cells that die. Cells don't live forever, and the immune system helps to eliminate or destroy those cells so that we don't have a buildup of dead cells in our body. It helps to take care of spent red blood cells, for example, and other types of cells that just normally expire. It also does a really fantastic job of looking out for cells that might have mutated and have the potential to become cancer. So it kind of cruises around our body. The cells of our immune system cruise around our body looking for mutated cells that they can then capture and eliminate. We also have some types of cells in our body that might attack our own cells. Our immune cells do a pretty good job of eliminating these autoreactive cells. If anybody has a cat or a dog or other sort of pet, you know that sometimes they get a little frisky. You might get a scratch on your finger from your cat. Your immune system helps to heal that scratch. So your immune system plays a really important role in helping your body to repair itself when it's injury. So it also identifies non-self material. So those bacteria and viruses that try to invade, our immune system can actually tell what's us and what's them, and is able to keep us protected from those agents that want to try to get into our bodies. Next slide, please. All right, this is a pretty complicated slide, but I've included it because it gives you a really nice overview of how you get to the point in your immune system where you develop antibodies. Remember, antibodies are parts of your immune system that can recognize specific pathogens. So if you go and get a vaccine for COVID, your body is going to be able to make antibodies against that piece of COVID so that your immune system can recognize the real COVID if it attempts to invade your body. So the antibodies provide that long-term protection to us. But to get to the point from infection to antibody, your immune system has to go through a series of steps. So if you look at the graph, on the left axis, we have the strength of response, that is how big or how small your immune system's response is. And on the bottom part of the graph is time. So that's how much time it takes from when you first get exposed to a pathogen like a virus or a bacteria to the point when you develop antibodies. And the whole time period takes 2 weeks to 4 weeks, depending on the type of antibody that we're talking about. And so you can see if you are challenged, for example, if you get a vaccination or if you get exposed to something, you have different parts of your immune system that are going to go up and go down. And those are just the signals that your immune system needs to get to the point where you have that long-term protection. And there are different parts of your immune system. We have one part that's called the innate immune system, and that's the part that really provides that barrier and that non-specific kind of, hey, you're not part of me, I'm going to attack you. And then you have the adaptive immune system, which is the part of the immune system that is going to be able to recognize new pathogens like COVID. So next slide, please. And I'm just to let you know, I'm about 30 seconds away from telling my husband to be quiet. So again, these antibodies are the proteins in your immune system that do provide that long lasting, and for many types of vaccines, lifetime protection. So you sometimes have to get boosters so that your antibody levels increase to a protective level. But very often you will have antibodies in your body that can protect you across your lifetime to ensure that your immune system responds to those pathogens if they are encountered. So the next slide, please. All right. So what happens when things go wrong in your immune system? Well, It depends. There are two types of immune dysfunction, or two situations where your immune system might not be responding in the way that it's supposed to respond. On one hand, on the downside of the teeter-totter, you might have a scenario known as immune suppression. That's when your immune system is lower than it should be. It's not responding as strongly as it should. And so that's really when we worry that we might be more susceptible to infections like COVID. We might not develop really strong antibody responses if we get vaccinated. We might be more susceptible to infections. So kids who get a lot of ear infections could have immune suppression. There's also an increased risk of developing cancers or types of tumors if your immune system is suppressed. On the other hand, if you're like me and you live in Eastern North Carolina, where there's a lot of pollen in the air, especially this time of the year, sometimes your immune system might respond a little bit too strongly, and you might get itchy eyes and a scratchy throat because of the pollen in the air. We shouldn't be responding to pollen, but sometimes our immune system will go a little over and above where it should go. And if that happens frequently, you may develop allergies or even asthma. And in some situations, the immune system can become stimulated so it no longer is able to tell that yourself is not something that it should be attacking. And we call that autoimmune disease, when your immune system ends up attacking its own cells and tissues and other cells and tissues in the body. Next slide. Sometimes we can have a situation where there's something known as inappropriate inflammation. A classic example of this is liver cirrhosis. If the liver is consistently injured, one of the responses is inflammation, but that consistent and persistent injury will lead to more and more damage to the liver, more and more scar formation from that persistent inflammation, until the point where the liver really isn't functioning normally anymore. Next slide. So what do we know about PFAS in the immune system? Do PFAS do anything to the immune system? And how do we know that PFAS do things to the immune system? Well, we've seen both sides of this immune dysfunction teeter-totter with PFAS. On the one hand, we've seen studies of people who have suppressed immune responses, and many of these studies show that certain populations, especially kids, don't develop as strong of a response to a vaccine as they should. We're not really sure if that leaves them more susceptible to infections. We're still generating data on that, but there is an increased risk for increases in infections. On the other side of that teeter-totter, then, we've also seen some epidemiological studies to indicate that allergy, asthma, and possibly even forms of autoimmune disease may arise from exposure to PFAS. In terms of studies in experimental animals, we actually have a lot of data to support this immune suppression linkage, to the point where we're fairly confident that one of the risks of PFAS exposure is a suppressed immune response. But remember, I'm using the term risk. That means that for any one person, we can't say, oh yes, you will develop a disease or you will not develop an effective vaccine response. It just means that there's a difference in your risk compared to somebody who doesn't have exposure to PFAS. Next slide. All right, so here's this figure again, but without all those other humps earlier on. And this is what we understand about exposure to PFAS. So if you look at the right side of your graph, we've got that black line that shows antibodies in a person who hasn't been exposed to PFAS. And then that gray line is hypothetically a person who has been exposed to PFAS. So they have a reduction in the level of antibodies. And this could be a reduction after a vaccine, when you want to have a good amount of antibodies to help protect you if you get exposed to a particular pathogen. So as I mentioned, we've uncovered this relationship in a number of epidemiological studies, and this relationship has confirmed in studies of experimental animals where single PFAS have been administered to those experimental animals. So we're pretty confident about this with respect to PFOA and PFOS, for example. In 2016, the National Toxicology Program actually did a systematic review. So they looked at all of the papers that had been published for PFOA and PFOS, and they determined that based on immune suppression, PFOA and PFOS were presumed to be immune hazards to humans. Again, because there's an increased risk of immune-related outcomes. Next slide. Okay, so here's another somewhat complicated graph, but what I wanted to highlight with this graph is that children appear to be more sensitive to the effects of PFAS that bring down that antibody level compared to adults. So if you look at the left side of the graph, you can see that we've got some bars with children represented, and on the right side of the graph, we have bars with adults represented. And these are from epidemiological studies or studies of people where they were given vaccines. And we can see that there were changes in vaccine responses for both adults and children, but children had those changes occur at lower amounts of PFAS in their bodies. So it took less PFAS in children for us to see those decreases in vaccine responses. We now understand that children might represent a vulnerable or sensitive subpopulation. The Lifetime Health Advisory for PFOA and PFOS in drinking water, for example, is based on protection of developing organisms. So infants who are still breastfeeding or being bottle fed. Next slide. So this is a figure from a paper that just recently came out, and this was led by Dr. Philippe Grandjean, who's at the University of Southern Denmark, as well as at Harvard University. And he has looked at the effects of PFAS in people, and he's looked at immune responses in people. And he and his team wondered, well, what can we start to learn about PFAS in people's blood and severity of COVID infection? They looked at a few different PFAS in the study and found that one particular PFAS known as PFBA, and I've got the figure for it there, it has 4 carbons in it and that functional group at the end. And they were able to get blood samples from people who had been to the hospital because they were infected with COVID. They were able to collect that blood and measure different types of PFAS. And then they asked, was there a relationship between how much PFAS there was in people's blood and how severe their COVID infection was? And if you look at the graph, and again, this graph is just for PFBA, you can see that people who had lower levels of PFBA in their blood had a short hospital stay or weren't hospitalized at all. And again, this is for people who were positive for COVID. People who had to be in the hospital for a little bit longer had higher levels of PFBA. And this is true for both males and females. And then if you go over to the very third set of bars, people who had to be admitted to the intensive care unit who then unfortunately passed away from COVID infection had the highest levels of PFBA in their blood. I want to emphasize that this is one study. We still have a lot more information to collect about how PFAS might affect COVID and how PFAS might affect a vaccine response to COVID. But this suggests that there's a relationship between PFAS and blood and how severe the COVID infection was, at least in the individuals in this particular study. Next slide, please. So this is my last slide. And here I want to emphasize what we know and what we're concerned about versus really what we don't know yet. We know that PFOA and PFOS can suppress vaccine responses, and we have growing data that other PFAS can suppress vaccine responses. But that's suppress. It doesn't render them completely useless. It doesn't mean that the vaccine isn't going to work. It just means that it takes you from a higher level to a somewhat lower level. We don't know if that reduces the efficacy or efficiency or strength of the vaccine. We just know that that response is decreased, and we can use that response to predict that that might change somebody's risk of developing a certain disease somewhere later in life. What we are worried about, though, is that PFAS and such as PFO and PFOS may really suppress vaccine responses. So there is a probability that PFOA, PFOS, and other PFAS could suppress vaccine responses to the COVID vaccine. Again, it hasn't been evaluated, but there is that potential risk. The bottom line is, though, if you can get a vaccination and you are able to get a vaccination, get a vaccination. A vaccination is going to give your body the ability to make those antibodies to help protect you against COVID or the flu or other viruses that you might be worried about. It's going to give your immune system that extra boost that it needs. So even if it's not as high as somebody who doesn't have a lot of PFAS, it's still going to give you that little bit of extra. And if you're concerned about the potential for a COVID infection because of your PFAS exposure, continue doing what you've been doing to protect yourself. Continue wearing a mask, continue washing your hands, and continue being socially distant as much as you can. I think that's my last slide, and I think that I'm happy to take questions for you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. DeWitt. We will be happy to take any questions that you might have. I know we have one already that has appeared in the Q&A. You can also raise your hands and we'll take care of that verbally as well. So I think the one in the Q&A from Maureen is she was interested in the units for the y-axis on slide 13. So that would be, I guess, this one. Is this the one we're talking about?
So in terms of the units on this slide, this is just the proportion of people that Dr. Grandjean and his team evaluated. So out of the total, what proportion had detectable levels of PFBA in their blood, and what were their responses to COVID in terms of hospitalization. So you can think of it as sort of a percentage of people in the sample. They just expressed it as a proportion.
Okay, and are there any other at this point in time? I know we had earlier, we had a few hands raised. I guess we can go ahead with Lawrence. And hold on, Lawrence, I have to be sure that we can unmute you.
Lawrence should have the ability to unmute now.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so kind of a follow-up on the last question. So what were the PFAS levels in the test group that had the diminished response? Were these trace amounts? Were they high levels? And do we know anything about where they got their PFAS exposure in order to have that depressed response?
So are you talking about the figure where I showed the PFAS exposure and vaccine responses in adults and children? So if we could go up,
exactly.
I think slides.
Exactly.
Next slide. So slide number 12. So here, this is the geometric mean, and this is a summary from a series of different studies. So if you look at the x-axis, you can see that there's a 20, 22, 23, 24. So those are references to 4 different epidemiological studies. And if you look over at the y-axis, you can see for children, for PFOA, there was about 5 nanograms per mil. For PFOS, there was around 16 or 17 nanograms per mil for the anti-tetanus and anti-diphtheria vaccines. For anti-rubella, the levels were quite low for PFOA. The light gray bar is PFOA. They were around 2 or so nanograms per mil, and then the PFOS was about 5 nanograms per mil. If you look over at the adults, the levels range for PFOA from about 5 all the way up to about 30. And then for PFOS, it was not measured for the one study. And then for the anti-mumps and rubella, it was around 20 nanograms per mil, which is a standard way of expressing PFOA and PFOS in people's blood. But again, that's the median or geometric mean. So the middle of the ranking of people who had their blood measured. In terms of sources of exposure, these are from populations where there are high environmental exposures. So some of these were from folks in the West Virginia area. And I think at least one was from the general population. So kind of background levels.
Thank you.
Yes, no problem.
I think we have a fairly easy one from Jennifer. This is in the Q&A, and she's asking if the slides will be available to review after the presentation. She would like to share them with someone else.
I'm comfortable with sharing the slides.
Okay. Let's go with Megan, who has her hand raised.
Hi there. With regards, oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. With regards to the reduced vaccine effectiveness, can you explain how, given the scope of PFAS contamination, sort of, not just in the United States, but also globally, how that could potentially implicate our projections for herd immunity?
So that's a fairly complicated question. And I think that, herd immunity is something that occurs when enough people are exposed or vaccinated in a population so that the pathogen that we're talking about doesn't really have an opportunity to spread. So that means that enough people have protective immunity so that the pathogen just kind of dies out. It doesn't appear. I don't think that we've really assessed vaccine responses enough on a global scale to understand the implications of PFAS across the globe. We've looked at populations, and we know that there are some populations that have declines in their vaccine responses. But in those same populations, we have not yet seen robust increases in infections. So while the decrease in vaccination does represent an increased risk of a reduced immune response, not yet at least measured out or gone out enough in time to determine if that means an increased infection and an infection or a decrease in our protection against various viruses and bacteria against which we're vaccinated. I hope I sort of answered your question.
You did. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, and John, I see your hand raised. We'll get to you in just a second. I want to take Lisa's question. She says in the Q&A, were the people in the study all in the hospital, or where did they get participants?
So the study done by Dr. Grandjean, it was from individuals in Denmark, and he was able to get the blood from the hospital. So these were all people who had gone to the hospital, had their blood collected, and then later were found to have a positive COVID response or COVID test. Some were hospitalized and some were not. So all of the blood came from blood that had been banked from the people who had gone to the hospital because of COVID.
And Kevin, along the same lines, has a question about this same slide that's up. Were any of these children located locally, like Hatboro, Horsham, or Warminster?
I don't believe that any of these studies that are presented here concerned anybody from Pennsylvania. I believe that they were from the general population all over. So there could have been some Pennsylvania residents in some of the data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey data, but the others were from either Europe or from the West Virginia area, Ohio, West Virginia area of the United States.
Okay, John Kolb, if you'd like to go ahead, I know your hand is raised. We'll see if we can get you unmuted.
John, you should have the ability to speak now. Just take yourself off mute. Okay.
Yeah, John, we still can't hear you if you're talking. So we'll go ahead with another question. Oh, go ahead. Looks like you're unmuted now.
Okay, I had several times. In looking at this and listening to what you're saying, okay, I have PFOS based off of the study of a 22.9. I have two forms of cancer. One is mantle cell lymphoma, the other is bone marrow cancer. Based on what we're saying then, is it advantageous for me to get the vaccination? Because number one, I'm already at high levels. And with the bone marrow cancer, my body is rejecting a lot. Has there been anything to look at to what happens to people who already have cancer and have high levels of the PFOSs? Is it effective?
Well, first, John, let me say I'm sorry that you have multiple forms of cancer that you're trying to manage and deal with, and I hope that you have good healthcare providers who are taking care of you. With respect to getting a vaccination, I think that's something that you should discuss with your treating physician to determine that it's safe for you to get a vaccine, considering your cancer and where you might be in your treatment process. With respect to the levels of PFAS in your body, that does create some additional risks for you. And hopefully your healthcare provider can help to guide you through those decisions that you need to make so that you can go back out into the world and feel safe about interacting with people.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, John. Let's go to Thomas's question. Thomas Pritchett, he says, do the red lines indicate what would be normal range without PFAS contamination?
Oh, no, sir. I'm sorry. I should have explained those. I included the red lines to show that that's the difference between the highest level in children and then the highest level in adults. So the one red line towards the bottom shows the highest concentration of PFOS for children. And then that red line at the top shows the highest level of PFOA for adults, to show you that there's a difference between adults and children, and that adults have this response with higher concentrations of PFAS, whereas children have this response at lower concentrations. This indicates that there's a gap between adults and children in terms of the amount of PFAS that it takes to induce this suppression of the vaccine response. I should have explained.
Jamie, you
Okay,
accidentally muted yourself.
Oh, yeah, I was finished talking.
Oh, all right.
and we'll go to James's question before we get to Megan's hand raised there. So James is saying, how well do we know the biological half-life of PFAS chemicals? With changes to water supply perhaps years ago, are there means for back calculating the P concentrations that a person may have had in their body 5 to 10 or even more years ago?
Wow, that's a great question. And I can tell that whoever asked the question has been doing a lot of reading. So we know that for PFOA and PFOS, for example, the human half-life is 2 to 5 years. For PFHXS, the half-life is 8.5 years. For something like PFBA, we think the half-life is about a month or so. So there's variability in how long it takes for half of the amount of that PFAS that you have in your body to get peed out of your body or eliminated out of your body in some other way. There have been some scientists who are probably much, much smarter than me who have developed some really great models for taking water concentrations and predicting back to what somebody's blood concentration was when the PFAS in the water was at a higher concentration before treatment. They actually did this, and if Dr. Savitz is here, he might be able to answer this question. As part of the C8 science study, this is one of the calculations that they did to better understand past exposures to people who are drinking water contaminated with PFOA in the Ohio, West Virginia area.
Thanks, Jamie. Again, just very briefly, the general idea is that if you know something about what the water level was and when the exposure to the contaminated water ended, and know your current blood levels, and again, it's not a simple calculation. You can back calculate what it would have been in a steady state when that was your source of water on an ongoing basis. It's not exact, but if you know something about the historic levels in the water, you can do a pretty good job of back calculating what it would have been when that was your primary source of drinking water.
Yes, and this is actually something we're planning to do as part of this study. So when we're trying to get information from this whole area of the water supply, we have Ted Lillis, who's actually going to be part of his job is to figure out back in time what the water exposure was. And then we have another member of our team, Tim Fennell, who's working on what they call PK modeling. And that's where they'll be taking the serum level and other types of exposures and this calculated water values to sort of try to replicate what your historical exposure would be. So this is something we're doing here, and why it's very important that people who participate, that we get a blood sample from them.
Okay, so let's go ahead with Megan. I see your hand is raised.
Hi there. What, if anything, is being done to ameliorate the psychosocial impacts of PFAS contamination on these communities in a post-COVID world?
So I think that question is way outside of my abilities to answer. I don't know if somebody else would like to answer that question.
I think Dr. Risa Jones could probably answer that, or possibly Laura Werner.
Laura, would you like to go first and then I'll follow up?
Sure. I mean, it's obviously, we would acknowledge that living in communities with a long-term environmental contamination problem like this is stressful. And I work for ATSDR, and we actually just this week put out a new resource center for communities trying to, but communities and health professionals to try to address the effects of stress from this kind of experience. I mean, you can actually have health effects just from experiencing stress. And so we acknowledge that this is a really important problem, and we've got some tools out there to try to work with communities. It involves a lot of partnership with the affected community and those working with them. And we don't have anything specific started yet in this community. I know some of the Bucks Mount folks that are here with us on this team have helped ATSDR develop these resources. So they have played a role in trying to work on this important problem.
The work that we've been doing at Temple in collaboration with Bucks Mount Coalition for Safer Water, we've been purposefully trying to elucidate the nuances of psychosocial effects. There isn't a lot that's being done right now to address that. And our goal, in addition to helping create community outreach materials, is actually to look at creating validated scales or instruments that would help us capture people's experiences. There are scales that measure stress or coping with natural disasters like Katrina, for example. But to our knowledge, there aren't validated scales or instruments that look at this kind of chronic exposure and how that can impact people. So that's the next step for us as we start analyzing that data, applying for future funding to develop and validate instruments.
Okay, I think we can take two more questions and then we really need to move on. So one of the questions, let's see here, is any information available regarding those who are already diagnosed with autoimmune disorders?
You know, autoimmune disease is one of those areas of PFAS effects about which we know very, very little. There's a little bit of information from studies of people, from epidemiological studies, but we have almost no information from studies in experimental animals because we don't have good models for autoimmune disease in experimental animals. And so I think, you know, again, I'm not a medical doctor, but I think the best thing to do would be to appropriately treat the autoimmune disease as best you can, and as best you can, avoid additional PFAS exposures. So try to do some exposure reduction. But if you're living in a community where you don't have much of a choice, I know that's pretty lame advice. And I hope that, again, you have a good healthcare provider who can help you manage that disease.
Thank you. And now we'll go to John. I see you have your hand raised again. So this will be our final question for now, and then we will certainly answer them towards the end of the session tonight. So go ahead, John.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Going back to the gentleman who was just saying that they're looking back to see what our PFO and S's would be at the height of our time there. I have addressed that on several times. On my block alone, 25 people have cancer. All of us have lived there prior to 1982. And the statement that's being made back to me by your folks is, well, we need a bigger picture. We got to see if it's, people who've only been here for 5 years. Well, if you go for people who are 5 years and you go for people who are 40 years and you compare the two as a total group, it dilutes that. But I can give you a block in Warminster, there's 25 people on that block. My wife just died of it. Are they going to look at people who have been there for a long time and start to say, okay, we really need to concentrate on the long-time residents?
So I think we're going to be discussing our eligibility, and you'll see that it's going to cover the time period of people live in this area from 2005 to 2017. And we did this for two reasons. One is, as Jamie discussed, about the half-life. So because of the half-life of the chemicals themselves, trying to reconstruct back 50 years really wouldn't be very effective. So we wanted to try, and people were exposed. I mean, we can sort of extrapolate, we can extrapolate backwards further than 2005, but we wanted to be able to capture that time window because that's when the serum levels in your blood that show PFAS are going to be most effective for us. We can obviously go back then with our calculations for the water further back in time. So, we're trying to get the most information that we can, and we stop at 2017 or so, because more of the water was treated by then. I mean, there might still have been a few wells, but we're trying to maximize, where we'll get the people who had the highest exposures that we can really capture. So I think you can ask a little more questions when we talk about, show you our maps and that type of thing, but that's sort of our general idea.
One quick question then. Are you willing to take a person who's been in that long-term group upon his death, which will probably be within the next 2 years, take his body and use it to check the PFAS back then?
Well, that's not, I mean, we certainly, appreciate the offer. I don't know, that's not certainly in the scope of what this particular project does. And yeah, I don't know if there would be some other government projects or university projects down the road that would be doing those type of things, but that's not in what we're being funded to do in this particular study, although I'm sure, I appreciate that, that this would certainly be an interesting other type of study for someone to be doing, but that's not what I'm being paid to run in this particular study. We're using serum samples to measure PFAS in this particular study.
Okay, so we do have to move on to the rest of our presentation tonight. So I do want to introduce Ms. Hope Gross and Ms. Joanne Stanton. So if we could go to that slide, yeah, right there. They are with the Bucksmont Coalition for Safer Water. They have been an incredibly valuable voice in terms of giving us the voice of the community, and they provide so much good insight for us. So we're so happy to have them, as part of the study team. So I'm not sure who wants to talk first, but go ahead, Hope and Joanne.
Hi, thank you so much, Susan. This is Joanne Stanton. And as Susan said, along with Hope Gross, we co-founded the Bucksmont Coalition for Safer Water. First, on behalf of the community, I really want to thank Dr. DeWitt. That was an excellent and really informative presentation. So thank you so much for giving up your time this evening. At each of these community meetings, we wanted to highlight a different community member who expressed interest in participating in this study. There were short videos titled Community Voices. With each interview, we hope to share a different perspective or personal experience, or even a motivating factor for study participation. Cameron, can you go to the next slide and then just start the video? Thanks.
My PFAS story starts with the simple fact that I can't believe the military knew they were using harmful chemicals. They literally build up in the human body. They were warned that it could get into our drinking water, yet they kept on using it. I'm horrified by this. This is what I can't get out of my head. Hi, my name is Ann Blastic. I have been exposed to contaminated drinking water from the military my entire life. First, my childhood home was 100 yards from the Warminster Naval Air Base, right across the street. Then, when I was old enough to move out, I moved to a property adjacent to the Horsham Naval Air Station, within a few hundred yards of the base where the fire training area was. Later, I moved my family just north of the Horsham base to Warrington, where I continued my legacy of drinking this contaminated water. I suffered from unexplained health issues my entire adult life, and so do my children. I have many autoimmune issues. I have thyroid disease, I have coronary artery disease, I have high cholesterol, severe arthritis. All of these chronic health problems are associated with PFAS exposure. I had a heart attack at 47. Now I eat clean, I'm a vegan, I don't eat meat, I don't eat dairy, yet my cholesterol is through the roof with no explanation. I know in my heart my health problems are related to the drinking water. I watch them burn planes and put fires out with the foam all the time. The fire training center was right down the street. It lit up the sky at night. For me, this study is important to have my blood tested and know what my PFAS levels are. I think my level will be high. I think I was right there in the thick of it every step of the way. Warminster, Horsham, Warrington. I drank from all the municipal wells. They all tested high for PFAS. I think for science, it's important to have people like me who live very close to the bases participate. I think having our data is super important. Let's learn as much as we can about the health effects of PFAS now. The only way I see to do this is to participate in this community study. Let's document the damage while we can, while it's still lingering in our blood. It is important to me, and I hope it's important to everyone. Take my blood, take my children's blood. Let's get this all documented.
Wow. So I'm Hope Grosh from Bucks Monk Coalition, and that was an amazingly powerful message and story. And we thank Ann Blastic for sharing her time and efforts and her story in reference to, drinking PFAS her entire life. So if any of you know of anyone who would love to share their story with us, we are looking for others to film Joanne and I, and we're happy to speak to you. So please email us or contact us at our emails below. So next, we'd like to introduce Sterling Cummings, who will provide us with some details about the eligibility of the community health study. So thanks again for all joining tonight.
Good evening, everyone. My name's Sterling Cummings, and I'm a research statistician at RTI International. I'll be speaking a little bit this evening about eligibility and recruitment for the Pennsylvania multi-site health study. Next slide, please. So we'll now walk through the recruitment process. The overall recruitment goal for the PA multi-site health study is approximately 1,000 adults and 300 children for a total of 1,300 participants. The study participants will be recruited in two major groups. The first group will be our so-called targeted participants, who will be selected from lists of known addresses within the areas near the military bases. These targeted participants will include, first, households with private wells that have been tested in the past and shown to have high PFAS levels that are equal to or greater than 70 parts per trillion. Secondly, we'll also include previous participants to the peat biomonitoring project, which was conducted by the PA Department of Health. And third, we will include residents closest to the military bases, of which we will select a sample from approximately 12,000 households in the area. The second wave of recruitments will be from volunteers from the 11 boroughs and townships surrounding Horsham and Warminster military bases. And these people will most likely respond to the study's community outreach and social media campaigns. Next slide, please, Cameron. So next, we'll look at a map of the study area. I did see something in the Q&A about a map of the affected area. I'd like to say this is not that so much as a map of where we have data where there are PFAS levels that have been detected in the past. The map you see shows the geographic boundaries of the 11 townships and boroughs that define the study area and the Horsham and Warminster military bases, which are the light cross-hatched areas in that dark purple area. The dark purple area itself and the red dots designate the targeted areas mentioned in the previous slide. For the targeted areas, we have historical water data and information on the water distribution network. Similarly, we have historical data on the private wells with elevated levels of PFAS, which are represented by the red dots. Residences of peat participants are not shown, but you can assume the majority fall within the dark purple area there. The volunteer areas include the initial 3 townships and 1 borough outside of the targeted area, which is green. And that was part of the initial research concept. In light blue, we have an additional 6 townships and 1 borough that we are now including. This expansion of the protocol was based on stakeholder feedback we have received. The study team has also identified a study office location, which is represented as a gold star in the center of the map. Next slide, please. Next, I'll say a few words about who's enrolled in the study. We intend to recruit adults and children who consent to participate. For the purposes of the study, we define adults as 18 years and older. Children are defined as ranging from 4 to 17 years of age. Also, to be eligible, participants must have lived in the study area at any time from 2005 to 2017, as Dr. Brown said earlier. Some people within the study areas are not eligible. This includes people exposed to PFAS through their job or work. We also would like to exclude people who are incarcerated or under house arrest, as this would limit their ability to participate fully in the study. So this is the end of my slides, and thank you for your attention. I would now like to introduce you to my colleague, Suzanne Triplett, who will tell you a few words about the study office side. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Sterling. I'm Suzanne Triplett. I'm a study director at RTI International. I work on a lot of different exposure studies, and I work closely with Dr. Linda Brown on the operational aspect of the study. Next slide. So this is a picture, as Sterling mentioned, of our site office. We are very close to signing a lease that will be located in Warminster, Pennsylvania. The address is displayed here. We're looking forward to achieving that milestone of the study. It gets us closer to launch. Next slide. So a little bit more about our site office. I think we've gone over this in a few community meetings, but this will be a local site office. It will be one site office for the Pennsylvania site. This will be our operational headquarters for training and recruitment. The site office will be offering appointments early in the morning to accommodate participants for fasting blood samples. We will be recruiting locally for positions as well. Office managers, research associates or interviewers, also several clinical research associates who will be administering the child neurobehavioral assessments. We'll be hiring several phlebotomists and also laboratory technicians. All of our staff are going to be following COVID-19 safety procedures. So if you've been to a doctor's office during COVID, certainly mask usage, other safety measures will be in place to protect study participants. Our hiring, we anticipate, will start fairly soon. We haven't released our job descriptions just yet. We'll be hiring our office manager first in the spring, and following that with our other local positions, posting those in the summer. Okay, next slide. And for the community, a quick schedule update on where we are. We're doing a lot of preparation right now on project startup, training material development, protocol development and implementation. That is going on right now through the spring. We hope to have our lease signed soon, and once our lease is signed, we'll be preparing the office, getting that set up with our site office manager. And our data collection and recruitment, we anticipate that will begin in late summer 2021 and continuing for approximately 6 months through the winter of 2022. So it might be a little bit longer. We'll see how the recruitment goes and what type of response we get. We are targeting enrolling 1,000 adults and 300 children. So next slide. This is a slide that just presents some more information, our study website. I know a lot of people have visited that. If you need general information about the study or have a question, you're welcome to give us a call or send us an email. If you have questions about the Community Assistance Panel, or CAP as we call it, feel free to email Susan Wood at the Pennsylvania Department of Health. Her contact information is located on this slide, and it is also on our website. Next slide. And we're also pleased to announce that we have our social media set up. So that was kind of a good milestone to reach this month. We have our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram accounts up. So that is now, we'll be posting updates to that for the community. So that's another way to connect with us. And the next slide, I think I'm going to turn this over to Susan Wood.
Thanks a lot, Suzanne. It's exciting for us as the study team to be reaching this point where we have the office, selected, and we're going to hopefully get started with things. So we are happy to address any questions that you might have. Again, you can raise your hand to verbally ask questions or submit questions through the Q&A feature. We ask again that you not use the chat, but rather go with the Q&A. So just already some things that really have to do more with recruitment and study design. Somebody is asking, can we volunteer for the study or do we need to wait to be recruited? Do you want to answer that, Linda?
Yeah, so I think, certainly, you can't volunteer yet. So, but we will be announcing through social media, community outreach and we plan to have a kickoff meeting actually. So look forward to that too. We'll be announcing that through social media. So first thing we'll have, like a virtual kickoff meeting. It'd be nice if we are able to have one in person, but I don't know that we'll be there yet with COVID. So we'll probably have to have a virtual kickoff meeting, and that will really probably open the study. And then at that meeting, we would tell you how you could contact us if you wanted to participate. And there will be a short screener, just to make sure that you did live in our areas during the time period and, we're the right age and that kind of thing. We're not a firefighter, some basic things like that. And, at that point, if you did qualify, there would be the opportunity to answer an interview right there over the phone. I think it's about 30 minutes for adults. And as Sterling showed, there is the target areas we're actually going to send postcards or mailings to some of the people either that had high levels in their well or lived near the bases. And the reason is that those people are going to be the most informative because they're more apt to have the highest levels of PFAS in their blood. So we're making extra effort to let them know, you know, inviting them formally to participate, but there'll be plenty of social media signs around your community with information to let you call in and, you know, get screened to participate in the study. So there's more of that to come, and we can discuss it at, you know, our kickoff meeting for sure.
And also having to do with eligibility and geography, somebody's asking, is this only wells or is public water also involved?
Oh, well, so yeah, and Sterling showed that big map. So the wells, so the red dots are, you know, those people who have lived at that address right now will be sent like a special letter, as will all the people in that dark purple zone, right? Or at least a sample of people. I'm not sure how many households, but a large sample of people in that purple zone. And we are taking people exposed through both public wells and the public water supply.
Okay, and a question from Gina. What studies have been done regarding long-term exposure? For example, her family has lived about a half mile from the Willow Grove Air Base since 1970. And she's asking, how do we determine when our peak exposures were and possibly our cumulative exposures? Not sure if that might be for Ted or for Linda
or maybe David could take a crack
at
that.
David, right?
Sure. No, I'll be happy to give it a little bit of context, and then you know, in general terms, you know, in studies of this nature, the goal, of course, is to do the best we can to reconstruct a lifetime of exposure history for the people who are participating. And so, knowing something about where you've lived, how long you lived there, and so on, which will be ascertained in part of the study, there is a model developed which estimates your exposure year by year. It's exactly what we did in Ohio and West Virginia. Again, it's not a perfect calculation, but it's a reasonably accurate back calculation for the long-term history, so that when we ask about the potential health effects, we're not just saying what is your current level of exposure, but we're saying what was it over the last 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. That is part, as Linda had said, this is part of the protocol that is included in this study. And I don't know, maybe if we want to speak to the particular ways it would be applied here, but certainly we're aware that it's potentially important to really a lifetime exposure history.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Savitz. We have a question from Philip. At present, are there any diseases that are the result of overexposure? That might also be for Dr. Savitz too.
Sure, I think that, you know, obviously, if we knew all the answers, we wouldn't need to do studies like this. That would be, and that's certainly, as Dr. DeWitt said and others, that's not the case. We are still learning a great deal about this. But I think in terms of established relationships, the most strongly established, the relationship to elevated cholesterol is quite clear. Again, as Dr. DeWitt described, the impact on vaccine response is also something that has been located in a number of different studies. There are a number of others that are suspected and of concern, again, to varying degrees, with varying degrees of evidence. I think there's evidence of changes in liver enzymes, for example. There's not evidence of liver disease, but there's biological indicators that there may be adverse effects more broadly on the liver. There's, I think, the evidence on kidney cancer, obviously a serious life-threatening disease. There's recently been an important study that has really supported some earlier work, and I think elevates the level of evidence for that. Beyond that, there's a range of areas of concern, effects on exposure during pregnancy, on the fetal growth. The infant birth weight is something that's been seen in a number of studies. Changes in thyroid function and thyroid hormones. I mean, it's a fairly long list of conditions, let's say, of concern. And again, in many of these, the multi-site study, I'm not saying we'll have the final answer. That's not the way research works. But I really believe that with the quality of the work that's planned and will be done, we will be able to really improve the knowledge base concerning a whole variety of health outcomes. This isn't a study just looking at one disease or two diseases. It's really trying to look at a spectrum of diseases and health problems that are of concern. So that I think is just a sort of a quick overview of what has become a very large body of research.
Yeah, and the question, I was just going to say the questionnaire includes, 25 or 30 different targeted questions about the participants' health. So, and then, so we will be collecting a lot of information from you. So hopefully, and then there's probably one in here about, tell us anything else. So we really welcome participation.
Lisa, I see your hand. We'll get to you in just a moment. So Philip is asking, will we be contacted to volunteer through our email? That would be either Suzanne or Linda could answer that one.
Go ahead, Suzanne.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yes, I mean, we'll be sending invitations out via email, via mail, and we'll be publicizing on social media. And you don't necessarily have to wait to receive anything formally via email or via the mail. Once we make the announcement that our hotlines are open and we have our site office opened and staffed, and we hold that kickoff meeting that Linda was describing, once that 800 number is active, you may call in and answer those eligibility questions. And if you're eligible, can schedule an appointment to come in, give blood, take the health interview. So we'll be contacting people a variety of ways to gather enough participation and reach our study goals, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there was a question that was in the Q&A section and it's disappeared, but this was somebody who was in one of our former studies, who was a former study participant and wants to know if they will be contacted to volunteer to be enrolled. So I don't know that we're necessarily contacting former participants, but you are absolutely encouraged to enroll. We absolutely want you definitely to enroll in the study, if you're willing to do that, because I think we'll get some really good ideas as far as, serum levels. But I'm not sure that we would necessarily be contacting you directly.
From the PEAK study, you mean?
Yeah.
If they're in the PEAP study, they will be receiving a letter of invite, but we'll be contacting and posting the study start date on social media, sending letters out, sending emails out. So that announcement will be large. You can just call the study hotline number and be screened for eligibility.
Okay, thank you. Lisa, I see that your hand is down. Are you still interested in asking your question? Okay, in the meantime, Carol is asking, where can one test their water for levels of PFOS or PFOA or PFOS? And I think that would depend on whether you have a private well or whether you have public water. So I don't know, maybe Laura, if you are interested in answering that one.
No, it's a little complicated. We can't endorse a lab or anything, but there are a select number of private labs that are available that can test your water. I'll put my email in the chat. I'd be really happy to talk through what the options are for well testing with anybody who would like to reach out to me.
We have another question about fetal growth. So it was mentioned that there are suspected issues on fetal growth. Have there been any studies on autism for children born to parents that have high levels from long-term exposure? So I believe that would probably go to Dr. Savitz.
Or no, again, I recently actually read a paper on that topic, and it's very, very limited literature at present. Let's just start off with that. There's been quite a few studies looking at fetal growth. And so to the degree that establishes that there are, and it's well known, again, Dr. DeWitt mentioned, fetuses are known to be more, susceptible to many environmental toxicants. But, again, and there is some, I would say, limited suggestion of a possible effect. I'm trying to give all the hedge words because it's very, very, very incomplete. But certainly the question of whether elevated PFAS levels prenatally through the mother are related to risk the question is being asked, and there's at least some very preliminary evidence addressing it, which I would say is, again, modest suggestions, but that's very much a work in progress. It's a good question, though.
Okay, Lisa, did you want to ask a question? Okay, I'm not sure if she's able to. We'll go ahead with Megan. Megan has her hand raised if you would like to unmute.
Do we know what the levels were in the Bucksmont area relative to the other contamination sites? And I guess my question would be, were all the contamination sites in this study military related?
So I can start that, and no, they were not all military related. Some of them were industrial sites, and some, like in California, were actually related to wastewater and more general type of contamination. We don't have all the values from all the sites. I think Pennsylvania, I think it's somewhere in the middle of all the sites. There were some of the areas that were extremely high, had some very high values because they had like a tannery or something. I mean, they were, lived right next door to the industrial pollution. I think some of those sites were a little higher. And Laura may have some additional information too on that because she's been involved with some of the exposure assessment.
Just want to mention, of the 7 locations that are part of the multi-site study, only 2 of them involve solely DoD site contamination. So that'd be our site, Pennsylvania and Colorado. And then there's 2 other sites that they're looking at more than 1 location, and one of their locations has a military aspect. That's the Massachusetts and New York one. So it is a very mixed group in the overall multi-site study population. And we think that will be very helpful as we learn more about these exposures.
Right, so that's sort of what I said at the beginning. One of the goals of the multi-site study is to look at PFAS exposure in different populations. So that was one of the things that ATSDR and CDC was looking for when they chose the different sites, to get a variety of populations exposed to PFAS from different sources.
Okay, and then we have really 2 comments rather than questions. So Gina is saying she knows of 5 people in her development who have or have had liver disease, all diagnosed in their 50s and 60s around 1990 to 1995. They have at least 5 people in the development, all in their mid to late 50s, that have MS. So that I think is more of a comment than necessarily a question. And then Philip also had that he has lived in Warminster and Warrington, the area, since 1974. Wouldn't that make him a prime candidate to test in the study?
If he lived there between 2005 and 2017. So if he's still there, or if he was there during that time period. So I think it's, but if, for example, if you lived there from 1974 to 2000, and then moved away, you wouldn't be eligible for this particular study. And mostly because of the reason we said we probably wouldn't get a good reading of PFAS in your blood. And that was one of our markers of exposures. Not to say that you weren't exposed. This is just how this study, particular study, was set up to evaluate exposure.
Okay, we have another question, and this is about this is a person with a residence with private water, so private well, lived and had water from the Warminster Authority from 78 to 83. Then this person moved to Horsham, very near the Willow Grove base, and the Hatboro Water Authority provided the water from 83 until about 1996. Aqua then purchased it. So she does live in the purple area that we saw on the map. Maybe we want to put the map up. She has several health conditions and she's never had her blood tested. Will she be contacted? And her youngest son has had contaminated water for 34 of his 39 years. And he has a liver condition and lives in Abington. So I think the question there is, will she be contacted if she lives in the purple area?
And Sterling might talk about that. I'm not sure how many residents are actually in the purple area. We said we target about 12,000 for economic reasons, right? We said we personally target about 12,000 households. If there's 12,000 households in the purple area, that means we target everybody. And Sterling, I don't know if you have a better estimate. So we will be targeting a lot of the households in that purple area. But, you know, if, for example, your neighbor got a letter, a postcard, and you didn't, we would want you to call us anyway. You don't have to have a special invitation, you know, and we really want, you know, we want everybody, but we especially want the people with the, you know, the high risk wells and those who are living in the purple area, because your blood is really going to be the most informative for us. Or if you used to live there, right? So, you know, we're going to target those households right now, but maybe you're living in, you know, Northampton now, but you used to live right there. Then, you know, definitely call us because we're really interested in you.
Well, and the other thing, Linda, too, just to remind everyone, if you register for these community meetings, we have your email addresses, and so we frequently send out updates, and we'll be sending a notification to our email distribution list, letting you all know when the study is open and when the hotline number is available to call. So, in that sense, Carol and others will have, you know, will receive that update.
Okay, and so we don't have any more questions. Oh, one just popped up. All right, good. So is there somewhere that we can see a more detailed image of the group 1, the light purple area, or are these boundaries subject to change prior to launching the study?
Oh, I mean, the light purple area within the dark purple, those are the military bases.
Right. So I'm not sure, James, if you mean the light purple area surrounding the green.
Yeah, I could say something about that. And Ted, if he's on the call, he could chime in. That dark purple area is sort of an estimate based on data we already have on the municipal water distribution system and some of the wells in the area. So it may contract somewhat, it may expand somewhat, you know, if we obtain better data in the future. So, but right now, that is the best that we can estimate at this time with the data we have in hand. About, you know, showing a, you know, more detailed map, it really just follows the 3 township borders on the margins of it, and also around the military bases. So that's about as detailed as we're willing to show at this time, I think. But the details of this will come we will flesh this out a little bit better as time goes on.
Okay, and then our next question, who is covering the cost of the study research?
Oh, this is being paid by the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, but also actually it's through, they're getting the money actually from the Department of Defense. So I guess it's being funneled from the Department of Defense. And then there's also extra money that I think is being allocated from Congress that is going directly to ATSDR. So, but our money that we're getting is coming directly from ATSDR, which I think they're getting from the Department of Defense and maybe some additional money that was allocated through Congress.
Okay, and are there any other questions? Because I think we've addressed all the ones that we found in the Q&A, and I don't see any hands raised. So we'll give it another minute or so to see if anybody has anything additional. Or any other comments that our study team wants to make before we wrap up.
And we will be posting this presentation on our website. So that'll be viewable, and also I guess the video of this as well. Is that correct, Suzanne?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, we will be posting the entire meeting, so you'll be able to see the slides. And I think also, Linda, just as we have this map up right here, I thought I recall seeing someone ask are we changing these areas at all, but these are set for the study eligibility boundaries, Linda, correct?
Yeah, I think the only thing that Sterling was saying is that everybody in this whole that shows up on this map is eligible to volunteer for the study. I think he was saying that the actual targeted area may differ a little teeny bit, and that just means that the group of people we decide to send a mailing to could get a little bigger or a little smaller. But everybody that lives or did live in one of these townships, anytime during 2005 to 2017 is eligible to call us and get screened.
We do have one additional question that popped up. If you get more than your expected participants, will you close the study to further participants?
So we did ask ATSDR about that, and I think at the moment they told us we could plan for about 10% more. I don't know, some of the sites are very small. So for example, New Jersey has like 6,000 people in their little town they're studying. So it's possible maybe they won't be able to get all ours and they'll want us to recruit more. We do not know the answer to that question. So that would actually be a dream for us, to be able to recruit our population that we need early and give plenty of time to make sure that we are successful in getting all the information. And it also would be much more cost effective for us in the community if we could not have to drag out enrollment. So yeah, we'd love to be able to enroll early. That would make us much more comfortable. It's always, I know we have, looks like a really big area, but when we do explain more about the office procedures, there will be a blood draw, a urine collection. For children, there'll be a neural cognitive assessment where they'll have to come play games, and that takes about 60 minutes to 90 minutes. So it's not that these are easy things to do. The telephone interview itself is pretty easy, but the whole thing is we want to get a lot of information from you. So that's why we welcome everybody sort of thinking about participating, so we can make sure we can get our numbers.
Okay, are there any other questions that people have? Or anything that anybody else wishes to add? All right, so it looks like we have addressed everything that has come in so far. Obviously, if you think of other questions, you can always contact us. Suzanne had given you all of our contact information. You can also submit questions to me or to our website, and we will definitely get back to you as soon as we can. I want to thank you for attending tonight. We really appreciate your time. We know how busy everyone is, and there are a lot of distractions around right now. So we're always just so happy when you are able to attend our meetings. And the study just cannot happen really or be successful without your interest and your cooperation. So we are just very happy that you joined us tonight. And a recording of the meeting, as Linda mentioned, will also be available on the website as well. So I guess I'll send it over to you, Cameron, if you want to go ahead and wrap things up.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a great evening.